Okay, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to speak here. And I think it's important to recognise, which I think was mentioned in the blurb about the meeting, is today is the first UN declared international day against, well, they call them unilateral coercive measures, they're sanctions. And so there are events actually beginning to happen all around, kind of to raise awareness globally about what these sanctions actually mean. And I was on a webinar last night with colleagues in the US, and there was a speaker from Palestine, there was a speaker from Nicaragua, from Cuba, and from Venezuela. And the next steps in their campaign in the US is to encourage health workers in the US to sign up to a statement condemning sanctions and the fact that there have been more civilian deaths from sanctions as a result of sanctions over the last kind of 10-20 years than there have been people killed in conflict. And I think that that's an incredibly powerful reason for this an international campaign just condemning sanctions. Sorry, just find the beginning. So just to talk about Nicaragua, but Nicaragua is just an example, and it could be a lot of what's happening in Nicaragua could apply to a lot of other places. There are 34 countries around the world that are sanctioned either by the US and or the European Union. And so it's around a third of humanity that is under some form of sanctions. So that is kind of the scale of the issue that we're confronting. So in the case of Nicaragua, there was two key periods when there have been sanctions against Nicaragua. The first in the 1980s, and the second actually from kind of 2014 up until now. But whichever of those periods, the objectives are the same, to make the living conditions so unbearable that it opens the way for regime change, and the wider issue is access to resources. So wherever these sanctions are happening. So in the case of the 1980s, that was the period of the Sandinista Revolution in 1979, and the Sandinistas were in power until 1980, actually implementing in whatever way they could a socialist state out of the ruins of Nicaragua at that time, from an earthquake and from a very long civil war. So in 1981, when the Reagan administration came to power, they immediately launched a kind of war against Nicaragua. But they actually described it as this is a low intensity war. They weren't going to it wasn't going to be a direct invasion, but it was everything short of a direct invasion. So it was arming the Contra, arming, training, funding the Contra, who operate in Honduras, who were staging raids into Nicaragua to destroy the infrastructure. But infrastructure was schools, it was hospitals, it was agricultural infrastructure, particularly in the northern part of Nicaragua. And this low-intensity war actually resulted in more than 20,000 Nicaraguans who died over that period. So that's the idea. That's what the US thinks is a low-intensity war. But coupled with that, there was a lot of things that were kind of came together in a kind of integrated package as far as the US was concerned. So on top of that, there was the trade embargo. That was imposed, a total trade embargo imposed around 1985, 1986. And then there was and that had a devastating effect on the Nicaraguan economy. because, well, for obvious reasons, the trade that Nicaragua had at the time was 90% of it was probably with the United States, so that was cut immediately. I think I mean, obviously there was a kind of the international propaganda war that operated on so many different levels. So, well, that's kind of the inevitable story of Nicaragua, this communist state in our backyard, who is a threat to the national security of the United States, and that declaration was repeated kind of every year, as though this tiny country of 3 million people at the time was going to head for the Mexican border to invade the United States. So it was depicting Nicaragua as some kind of totalitarian dungeon that was a cancerous growth that was going to spread to the whole region. And so it was an incredibly intense period when there began to be shortages of almost everything you can possibly imagine. There were spy flights going across the Blackbird, which was also based in Greenham Common at the time. And so these spy flights were flying over Nicaragua, causing this incredible sonic boom. And we were out in the countryside, and we were talking about these spy flights, and they were asking us, well, is your country sending these spy flights? And so well, at the time, and the Thatcher government was kind of aiding and abetting. So that was during the 1980s, and by the time of the end of that period, the economy was in complete collapse. It was because 60% of the national budget was being spent on the military in order to defend the country. So many people had, as I mentioned, more than 20,000 people had died. There were tens of thousands more who'd been injured, and the inflation was spiraling out of control, and the country was in a state of ruin at that point. And then there were elections in 1980.
1990, was it?
1990. Where the US kind of cobbled together a coalition of 15 parties called UNO, and they actually won the elections, technically free and fair elections. But on the other hand, Nicaraguans were voting with a gun at their heads, because they were being promised, well, if you vote for UNO, the war will end immediately. We'll lift the sanctions immediately, and there'll be a flow of dollars from the United States to Nicaragua. So the Sandinistas were out of power for 17 years, through till 2007. And then they began where they'd left off in 1990, but absolutely determined they were going to do whatever they absolutely could to prevent economic collapse. And I mean, they have done that actually fairly successfully, because the people who are going to suffer most from economic collapse are going to be the most vulnerable people in the poorest in society. But from about 2014 onwards, there was beginning to be some level of sanctions against Nicaragua, and that intensified after there was an attempted coup in Nicaragua in 2018, which was chaos throughout the country. So since then, various people who have participated in the coup or were instigators of the coup, or who aided and abetted in some way, have actually been arrested, and quite a lot of them were imprisoned. and so they became political prisoners. And their cause was actually taken up by quite a number of actually human rights organisations internationally. And I think one of the problems I think often with human rights organisations is they tend to look at human rights as meaning political rights, and they ignore the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which actually it's very kind of holistic. I mean, it's talking about the right to healthcare, the right to housing, the right to a decent living, etc., etc. So with a narrow focus on political and civil rights, yes, you could argue that the rights of some people who instigated a coup were obviously curtailed by the Nicaraguan government. But it's quite a long and complicated debate. But what's actually happened over the years is that the US has begun to sanction. They started by sanctioning individuals. They sanctioned some members of the National Assembly. They sanctioned the National Police. They sanctioned some members of the judiciary. They sanctioned some ministers as well. What that actually meant, that those individuals had their bank, if they happened to have bank accounts in the US, they were frozen, or if they had any assets in the US, they were taken or stolen. And as a result of all that, it did have a knock-on effect to international financial transactions relating to Nicaragua. I mean, this is just a really minor example, but it's just so an illustration of how far these things have implications. Like we were trying to get a card reader at Nicaragua Solidarity. So no, well, you can't have one because of the US sanctions against Nicaragua. And obviously it's a million times worse for Cuba, but it's just a way illustration of how the tentacles of all this spread. And I think then after that, well, I think the most recent development is probably much more serious potentially, because in October the trade representative in the US actually circulated a statement to the effect that the US is proposing to impose 100% tariffs on products from Nicaragua entering the US market. And although the Nicaraguan government has been very successful in diversifying trade, still it's more than half of the products from Nicaragua exported to the US. But I mean, if they go ahead with that, it's actually in contravention of a free trade agreement between Central America and the US, which I think the Nicaraguan government have managed very well, because they've actually managed to find markets for products like coffee, for example, or other exports from small-scale farmers, to take advantage of that free trade agreement to establish partners in the US. So it would have a very devastating effect on small-scale farmers in very rural areas. And because Nicaragua is actually a partner with other Central American countries, it will potentially destabilize the whole region. So it's a very serious threat. But I think it's really important to see this as a kind of pincer movement on the part of the Trump administration, to, I suppose, the way they see it, we're going to recover our backyard. this is our backyard, and this goes back to 1823, to the Monroe Doctrine. This is our sphere of influence. So the other things that are happening at the same time are obviously the threat to invade Venezuela, but also the manipulation of the Honduran elections, which happened last weekend, when Trump actually put out on dreaded Truth Social, that if the Honduran people did not vote for his chosen candidate, a candidate of the right wing, Honduras would suffer the consequences. A cut off of support. Potentially, I think that this was actually probably what frightened a lot of Hondurans to such an extent. The cut off of remittances being sent by Hondurans living in the U.S. to their families in Honduras, to go to the polls with that threat hanging over people's heads. It was the worst kind of interference. So for the next, I think it's a 5-year term, the Hondurans will be back in a situation with a far-right government supported by the Trump administration. So there's a huge amount of trepidation about Honduras going backwards to a period when they had a right-wing government, right-wing president, who was a narco trafficker. And after he left power, I think it was 2021, somewhere around there, he was extradited to the US, and he was tried in a court in New York. And he was sentenced to 42 years for drug trafficking and a whole lot of other complicated offences associated with that, gun running, and etc. But last week, Donald Trump announced that he felt that Juan Orlando Hernandez had been treated very, very unfairly, and he's now been released from prison. So this is the level of insanity, in incredibly cruel insanity that's happening. But I think all these factors, with the tightening of the blockade on Cuba, what's happening in Nicaragua, what's happening in Venezuela, and what's happening in the Honduran elections. I mean, it's no coincidence that all these things are happening at once. And I think, just on a more positive note, I finished in a minute. I'm going on too long. I think the Mexican president a few days ago came out with a very strong statement in support of Venezuela. Gustavo Petro, he is now for I think it's an annual period. It's a turnaround over a year, and so he's speaking on behalf of CELAC, which is a kind of community of states in Latin America that actually excludes Canada and the US. So he's actually today, I think, or yesterday, put out a very strong statement in support of Venezuela. So I think there's a kind of growing, not that this is kind of, a whole mix of politics going on across Latin America, but there are positive things happening. And I think there's also positive is that quite a number of countries who've come out in support of Palestine as well, including Nicaragua, that's taken a case against Germany in the ICJ, International Court of Justice, for aiding and abetting the genocide in Gaza. So I think this is a dangerous time ahead, but I think there are some positive openings, but I think even from us from here, it's so critical that we continue our solidarity. And there's a Latin American conference that some of you may be aware of. It's happening in London on the 7th of February. So that'd be a really good opportunity to find out what's happening across the region and what different organisations are doing.
Thank you very much.